The morning sun glinted off the polished brass buttons of Captain James Wilson's dress uniform as he straightened his tie one last time. Today wasn't just any Thursday. It was a special ceremony honoring veterans at the Naval Memorial in Washington. Just at 32, James was one of the youngest captains in the Navy, his rise through the ranks a testament to his sharp mind and natural leadership. "You ready for this?" asked Commander Thomas, his mentor since Naval Academy days, clapping him on the shoulder. "As ready as I'll ever be," James replied with a small smile. Though public speaking isn't exactly what I signed up for when I joined the Navy, James had been asked to say a few words about his grandfather, a decorated Vietnam veteran whose story had recently been featured in a military history journal. It wasn't a huge event, just a small gathering of veterans, active service members, and a handful of politicians who always showed up for military functions. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock sharp. James sat in the second row, listening as various speakers took the podium. His mind drifted occasionally to the ship waiting for him back in Norfolk. The USS Liberty was his first command, and he felt a constant pull to be back with his crew. But duty called him here today to honor his grandfather and represent the new generation of naval leadership. As a congressman droned on about military funding, James felt a stir of movement near the back of the gathering. A small commotion of dark-suited men with earpieces moving with purpose. He didn't think much of it until he heard whispers ripple through the crowd. "Is that him?" someone murmured. "I think it is," another replied. James turned slightly in his seat and saw former President Donald Trump being escorted to a reserved section on the other side of the aisle. Even out of office, Trump commanded attention, his signature hairstyle and confident stride unmistakable. James had served under 3 commanders-in-chief during his career, including Trump for a brief period, but had never been in the same room as any of them. The ceremony continued without interruption. When it was James's turn to speak, he walked to the podium with measured steps, feeling strangely aware of the former president's presence. James spoke clearly about his grandfather's courage under fire in Vietnam, about the values of service and sacrifice that had been passed down through generations in his family, and about how those same values continued to guide the Navy today. "My grandfather used to say that when you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, it doesn't matter where you came from or what you look like," James said toward the end of his short speech. "What matters is whether you do your job and look out for your shipmates. That's a lesson I carry with me every day as a captain, and it's what makes our Navy the finest fighting force on the seas." There was warm applause as James stepped away from the podium. As he returned to his seat, he happened to glance toward Trump, who was nodding slightly, seemingly in approval. After the ceremony ended, people mingled in the reception area where coffee and light refreshments were served. James found himself in conversation with several veterans from his grandfather's era, listening to their stories with genuine interest. He was so engaged that he didn't notice the former president approaching until a Secret Service agent stepped into his peripheral vision. "Captain Wilson?" The voice was instantly recognizable, carrying the distinct New York accent that had filled countless news broadcasts and rallies. James turned to find himself face-to-face with Donald Trump. "Mr. President," he said automatically, standing a bit straighter. "Former President," Trump corrected with a small smile. "That was a good speech you gave. Your grandfather sounds like he was quite a man." "Thank you, sir." "He was," James replied, surprised by the personal comment. "The greatest generation, they don't make them like that anymore. Though looking at your record, maybe they do," Trump said. "Someone told me you're one of the youngest captains in the Navy right now. Got your own ship and everything." James was taken aback that Trump had apparently been briefed on his career. "Yes, sir. The USS Liberty. She's a destroyer." "Good ship?" Trump asked. "The best, sir. Though I might be biased." Trump laughed at that, a genuine chuckle that seemed to break the ice. "You know, I always said we needed to rebuild our Navy. When I was president, we put a lot of money into new ships. Some people didn't like that, but I bet you did." "The Navy appreciates having modern equipment, sir," James replied diplomatically, aware that they were starting to draw attention. A small circle had formed around them, and James could see people taking discreet photos with their phones. "Walk with me a minute, Captain," Trump said, gesturing toward a less crowded area of the reception. The Secret Service agents moved smoothly to clear a path. As they walked, Trump asked James about life at sea, about the challenges of commanding a ship with a crew of nearly 300 sailors. James answered honestly but carefully, mindful of both his position as an active duty officer and the high-profile nature of his conversation partner. "You know, I've always been tough on our allies about paying their fair share for defense," Trump said after James described a recent joint exercise with NATO forces. "Did that make your job harder or easier?" It was a pointed question that ventured into political territory. James paused before answering. "Sir, as naval officers, we carry out the policy decisions made by our civilian leadership. Our job remains the same regardless of what those policies are." Trump raised an eyebrow. "That's a very diplomatic answer, Captain." "I try to be, sir. But you must have an opinion." "Everyone does." James considered his words carefully. "What I can say is that strong relationships with our allies make joint operations smoother. At the same time, resources are always a concern for every navy in the world." Trump nodded, seeming to appreciate the balanced response. "Fair enough. You know, I've always respected people who can speak their mind without being disrespectful. Too rare these days." Their conversation shifted to broader topics: the future of naval warfare, the rise of China as a maritime power, the importance of technological innovation. James found himself engaged in a surprisingly substantive discussion, occasionally forgetting who he was talking to as they delved into the details of military readiness. A young woman in a press badge had edged closer to them, clearly trying to overhear their conversation. When Trump noticed her, he didn't seem bothered. In fact, he seemed to stand up a bit straighter. "So, Captain, tell me," Trump said, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "What's the biggest challenge facing someone like you in today's Navy?" The question felt like it had layers to it. James took a breath. "Balance, sir. Balancing tradition with innovation. Balancing the needs of the mission with the needs of the sailors. And personally, balancing being firm enough to command respect while being open enough to hear when someone under my command has a better idea than I do." Trump seemed to consider this. "Interesting you don't mention race. A lot of people would expect that to be a challenge for you." The directness of the comment caught James off guard. He was aware that several people nearby were now openly watching their exchange. "Sir, I won't pretend there haven't been times when my race has been an issue for some people," James said evenly. "But in my experience, performance speaks louder than anything else. My sailors care more about whether I can keep them safe and effective than about what I look like." Trump nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say. Merit-based. That's how it should be everywhere, don't you think? Best person for the job, period." "I believe in earning your position." "Yes, sir," James agreed, though he was careful not to be drawn into what could become a politically charged conversation. A Secret Service agent leaned in to whisper something to Trump, who nodded in acknowledgement. "Looks like I need to head out, Captain Wilson. It was good talking with you," Trump said, extending his hand. "Keep up the good work with your ship. Maybe I'll come visit sometime." "Thank you, sir. You'd be welcome aboard," James replied as they shook hands. As Trump moved away with his security detail, James noticed a reporter approaching him rapidly, notepad in hand. "Captain Wilson, Lisa Chen from the Washington Post. Can you tell me what you and former President Trump were discussing so intently?" James gave a polite but reserved smile. "Just naval matters, ma'am." The former president was interested in hearing about life at sea. "It seemed more substantial than that," she pressed. "Did you discuss race relations in the military?" "The former president and I had a private conversation about various aspects of naval leadership," James replied, maintaining his composure. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with my commanding officer before I head back to Norfolk." As James made his way across the room, he could feel eyes following him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his executive officer back on the ship. "Boss, there's a photo of you and Trump all over Twitter." "What's going on?" James sighed. What had been a brief, unexpected conversation was about to become something much bigger than he'd ever intended. James walked briskly down the hotel hallway, his phone buzzing nonstop in his pocket. The evening reception was scheduled to start in 30 minutes, and he'd hoped for a moment of quiet to gather his thoughts. Instead, his phone had exploded with notifications since his conversation with former President Trump earlier that day. "Captain Wilson," a voice called out. James turned to see Admiral Richardson, his commanding officer, waiting by the elevator bank. The Admiral's expression was unreadable. "Sir," James said, coming to attention. At ease, Captain. Let's talk. The Admiral gestured toward a small seating area tucked away in an alcove. You've caused quite a stir today. That wasn't my intention, sir, James replied as they sat down. I know that, Richardson said. But intentions don't always matter in Washington. That photo of you and the former president is everywhere. CNN, Fox, you name it, James sighed. It was just a conversation, sir. He approached me after my speech about Grandpa. And what exactly did you discuss? The Admiral's tone was careful, measured. Naval readiness, Allied cooperation, leadership challenges, James paused. He also asked about race in the Navy, but I kept my answers professional and non-political. Admiral Richardson nodded slowly. The Navy Public Affairs Office has already received dozens of media requests for interviews with you. The Secretary of the Navy called me personally. James felt a weight settling in his stomach. Am I in trouble, sir? No, you're not in trouble. You didn't seek this out. The Admiral leaned forward. But we need to be careful here. You represent the Navy, Captain Wilson. We stay out of politics. Yes, sir. I understand completely. Good. Richardson stood up. Attend the reception tonight. Be polite to everyone. But don't discuss your conversation with the former president. If pressed, simply say it was a brief, cordial exchange about naval matters. Nothing more. Understood, sir. As the Admiral walked away, James checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his mother, 5 from his sister, and dozens of text messages from fellow officers. Even his executive officer had sent a message. CNN just mentioned you by name, Skipper. What's going on? James slipped the phone back into his pocket.
He had 25 minutes to change
into his formal dinner uniform and prepare for whatever awaited him at the reception. The ballroom of the Washington Grand Hotel sparkled with chandeliers and polished silverware. Military officers in dress uniforms mingled with politicians and defense industry executives. It was the kind of Washington event James usually avoided, full of small talk and hidden agendas. He made his way through the crowd, nodding politely to those who recognized him. More than a few people gave him curious looks, and he overheard his name mentioned in hushed conversations. Captain Wilson, a woman in a navy blue dress, approached him. I'm Congresswoman Henderson. Your speech today was very moving. Thank you, ma'am, James replied, shaking her hand. I understand you had quite an interesting conversation afterward, she said with a meaningful look. James gave her the smile he reserved for delicate situations. It was an honor to speak with several veterans who served with my grandfather. The Congresswoman laughed lightly. Very diplomatic. You have a future in Washington if you ever leave the Navy. I'm quite happy at sea, ma'am. As the Congresswoman moved on, James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Commander Thomas, his old mentor. You've become the talk of the town, Thomas said quietly. How are you holding up? I'd rather be back on my ship, James admitted. This wasn't exactly in my plans for today. Well, prepare yourself. Thomas nodded toward the entrance. Your day is about to get even more interesting. James turned to see a commotion at the doorway. Secret Service agents were scanning the room as former President Trump made his entrance. The crowd shifted, people gravitating toward or away from the new arrival depending on their political leanings. I didn't know he was attending tonight, James said. Last-minute addition to the guest list. Apparently, Thomas replied. Rumor has it he specifically asked if you would be here. James felt a mix of surprise and unease. Why would he care? Maybe he enjoyed your conversation more than you realized. For the next half hour, James managed to keep his distance, engaging in conversations with fellow naval officers about safe topics like upcoming deployments and shared academy memories. But he could feel Trump's presence in the room like a gravitational force pulling everyone's attention. Eventually, the inevitable happened. As James was speaking with a retired admiral about submarine capabilities, he noticed the crowd parting. Trump was making his way directly toward him, trailed by aides and security. Captain Wilson, Trump called out, his voice carrying across the room. There you are. The room quieted noticeably as people turned to watch the interaction. James straightened his posture automatically. Mr. President, he acknowledged with a nod. Former President, Trump corrected again with a smile. Though who knows about the future, right? He turned to the retired admiral. Mind if I borrow the captain for a few minutes? The admiral nodded and stepped away, leaving James alone with Trump and his entourage. Your speech has been getting a lot of attention online, Trump said, along with our little chat. So I've heard, sir. Trump gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. Let's continue our conversation from earlier. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts. As they walked, James could feel dozens of eyes following them. This was exactly the kind of attention Admiral Richardson had warned him to avoid, but there seemed no polite way to refuse. They reached a small seating area partially screened by decorative plants. Trump's security detail created a loose perimeter, allowing them some privacy while remaining vigilant. You look uncomfortable, Captain, Trump observed as they sat down. With all due respect, sir, active duty military officers are supposed to stay out of the political spotlight. Trump waved his hand dismissively. This isn't political. This is two Americans having a conversation. Nothing wrong with that. James chose his words carefully. In Washington, conversations can quickly become political, especially when they involve a former president. And a rising star in the Navy who happens to be black, Trump added bluntly. That's what's really got people's attention, isn't it? The directness caught James off guard again. I'm just an officer doing my job, sir. Come on, Captain. We both know that's not entirely true. You're one of the youngest ship captains in the Navy, and you're African American. That makes you noteworthy whether you like it or not. James remained silent for a moment, considering his response. My goal has always been to be noteworthy for my abilities, not my demographics. Trump nodded. Merit-based. Like we talked about earlier. But let me ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Have you ever felt the Navy held you back because of your race? It was a loaded question, and James knew his answer could be twisted in a dozen different ways if overheard. But there was something in Trump's expression that suggested genuine curiosity. No, sir, I haven't, James said finally, but I've also been fortunate. I've had good mentors and fair commanders. Not everyone has that experience. So you think it depends on the individual situation? I think the military has made more progress on this front than many civilian institutions, James replied. When your life might depend on the person next to you, you tend to care more about their competence than their color. Trump seemed to consider this. That's a perspective more people should hear. The media always wants to paint everything as broken. Nothing is ever as simple as headlines make it seem, James said. Exactly. Trump leaned forward, animated now. You know, people are always surprised when I talk about my record with black unemployment numbers. Lowest in history during my administration, before the pandemic hit. But the media never wanted to focus on that. James nodded non-committally, aware they were drifting into political territory. What do you think about how minority service members are treated today compared to your grandfather's time? Trump asked, shifting the conversation slightly. This felt safer ground. There's no comparison, sir. My grandfather faced overt discrimination that would be unthinkable today. He wasn't allowed to lead white sailors when he first enlisted. He had to fight for every promotion. The progress has been real and significant. But people act like nothing has changed, Trump said. Like America is still the same as it was 60 years ago. Progress and problems can exist simultaneously, James replied. We can acknowledge how far we've come while still working on what remains to be done. Trump studied him for a long moment. You know, you're a good spokesman for the Navy, Captain Wilson. Thoughtful, balanced, not what people expect when they see a conversation between the two of us. What do they expect, sir? Conflict, drama, that's what sells these days. Trump gestured toward the room. Look at them all watching us, wondering what we're talking about, probably making up their own versions. James glanced around and noticed several people quickly averting their eyes. Others were openly staring, including a woman who appeared to be recording them discreetly on her phone. I should probably return to the main reception, James said, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. Before you go, Trump said, let me ask you one more thing. Do you think the average American sailor cares more about their shipmates' politics or their competence? Competence, without question, James replied without hesitation. On a ship, political discussions happen, but when emergencies arise, no one cares how anyone voted. They care if you know your job, Trump nodded thoughtfully. Maybe the rest of the country could learn something from that approach. As James stood to leave, Trump extended his hand. It's been good talking with you, Captain. Might be worth continuing this conversation someday. Thank you, sir, James said as they shook hands, aware that this seemingly simple gesture would likely generate even more attention. As he walked away, James could already see people typing on their phones, By morning, the second conversation would undoubtedly join the first as fodder for news cycles and social media debates. His quiet life as a Navy captain had just become considerably more complicated. James woke up to his phone ringing at 5:30 a.m. It was the Navy Public Affairs Officer, Lieutenant Commander Chen. "Captain Wilson, I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a situation developing," she said, her voice tense. "What kind of situation?" James asked, instantly alert despite the early hour. "Your conversations with former President Trump have gone viral. The video someone took last night has over 2 million views already. Every major news outlet is requesting interviews, and the Navy Chief of Information wants a briefing on what was discussed." James sat up in his hotel bed, rubbing his eyes. "I kept everything professional and non-political." "I believe you, sir, but context gets lost online. Some clips are being shared without the full conversation. People are filling in the blanks with their own assumptions." James sighed. "What do I need to do?" "For now, nothing. The Admiral wants you back on your ship as scheduled. No interviews, no statements. Let the Navy handle the press." After the call ended, James turned on the TV. Sure enough, his face appeared on the screen beside Trump's. The caption read, "Former President and Black Navy Captain's Conversation Sparks Debate." He flipped through several news channels. Each one seemed to have a different take on what had happened. Former President reaches across the divide. Military officer cornered by Trump at reception. Candid conversation on race relations goes viral. James turned off the TV, shaking his head. He'd said maybe 50 sentences to the former president, and now those words were being analyzed, dissected, and interpreted by strangers across the country. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "You're trending on Twitter. Call me." Another message followed from his executive officer. "The crew's talking about you and Trump. What should I tell them?" James texted back, "Tell them their captain is focusing on getting back to the ship, and they should focus on their duties too." The drive to Norfolk Naval Station was mercifully quiet. James had expected reporters to be waiting, but Navy security kept them at the gate. As his car approached the USS Liberty, he felt a wave of relief. On his ship, he was in command. Things made sense there. Commander Rodriguez, his executive officer, was waiting at the gangway. "Welcome back, Captain," she said as they exchanged salutes. "Good to be back, XO. How's the ship?" "Ship's fine, sir. The crew, however, has questions." James nodded. "I figured they might. All hands meeting in 30 minutes. Word spread quickly, and by the time James stepped onto the deck, the entire crew was assembled. Nearly 300 sailors stood at attention, curious eyes fixed on their captain. "At ease," James said. "I'm sure many of you have seen the news. Yes, I had a conversation with former President Trump. No, it wasn't planned. And no, I didn't say anything that violated our oath to remain politically neutral." He looked out at the sea of faces, young, men and women of all backgrounds, who served under his command. "The media will say what they want to say. Our job remains the same, to keep this ship ready for action and to serve our country with honor." "Any questions?" A young petty officer raised his hand. "Sir, they're saying online that you and the former president were arguing about race. Is that true?" "No, Petty Officer Chen, we weren't arguing. We had a civil conversation that touched on several topics, including racial progress in the military. It was respectful on both sides." Another sailor spoke up. "Captain, people are calling you a sellout or a token depending which side they're on. How do you feel about that?" James took a moment before answering. "I feel that people who weren't there shouldn't make assumptions about a conversation they didn't hear. I'm not a political symbol. I'm your captain. And right now we have work to do." The meeting ended, but James knew the questions wouldn't. As he walked to the bridge, Commander Rodriguez fell in step beside him. "The Admiral called while you were addressing the crew," she said quietly. "There's going to be an official inquiry into whether your conversations with Trump violated any regulations." James stopped walking. "An inquiry? I didn't seek him out. He approached me. I know that, sir. But apparently some Democratic congressmen are concerned that an active duty officer was engaging in political activity." "That's ridiculous," James said, frustration edging into his voice. "It gets worse," Rodriguez continued. "Some Republican congressmen are planning to invite you to testify about the true state of race relations in the military, whatever that means." James closed his eyes briefly. So both sides want to use me to score political points. Pretty much, sir. By afternoon, the story had grown even larger. Video clips from both conversations were playing on a continuous loop on news channels. Political commentators were analyzing every word, every gesture. James sat in his quarters, watching a split-screen debate between two pundits. What we're seeing is a carefully orchestrated attempt to soften Trump's image with minority voters, argued a woman in a red blazer. That's absurd, countered a man in glasses. This was a genuine moment between two Americans from different backgrounds finding common ground. Why can't you acknowledge that? Because it's naive. Captain Wilson was clearly uncomfortable. You don't know that. You're projecting. James muted the TV. Neither of these people had been there. Neither knew what he was thinking or feeling. Yet both spoke with absolute certainty. His phone rang. It was Admiral Richardson. Captain, I've got the Secretary of the Navy on the other line. He's requesting you come to Washington for a private meeting tomorrow. Am I in trouble, sir? There was a pause. Not exactly. But this situation has become complicated. The White House has taken an interest. The White House? Why would they care about a conversation I had with a former president? Politics, Captain. Everything in Washington is politics. The Admiral's voice softened slightly. For what it's worth, I think you handled yourself well from what I've seen. But this is bigger than you or me now. After the call ended, James sat at his desk, trying to process how a simple conversation had spiraled so far out of control. His computer chimed with an email notification, a message from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thank you for your honesty." Against his better judgment, he opened it. Captain Wilson, you don't know me. I'm a black teenager in Michigan who wants to join the Navy someday. I saw your conversation with former President Trump. My dad is a Republican and my mom is a Democrat, and they argue all the time. But last night they both watched you and actually agreed on something for once, that you spoke with honesty and respect. I just wanted to say thanks for showing that's still possible. Respectfully, Anthony. James read the email twice. Amid the chaos and politicization, this simple message from a stranger reminded him why the conversation mattered in the first place. His phone buzzed again. A news alert. Trump had just posted on social media about their conversations. My talks with Captain Wilson showed what real communication looks like. He's a credit to our Navy and our nation. Some in the media want to twist our words for their agenda. But Americans know authentic dialogue when they see it. Maybe Washington could learn something from the way our military focuses on merit and results. James set the phone down, knowing this would only fuel more coverage. Whatever Trump's intentions, his words would be seen as an endorsement, which could further complicate James's position as a politically neutral military officer. Commander Rodriguez knocked on his door. Sir, there's a call for you on a secure line. It's the Chief of Naval Operations. The highest-ranking officer in the Navy wanted to speak with him now. James straightened his uniform and took a deep breath. Put it through to my office, he said, as he waited for the call to connect. James glanced at the family photo on his desk, his parents, his sister and himself in his academy uniform at graduation. His father had warned him that day that as a black officer, he would sometimes face challenges others wouldn't. You'll have to be twice as good and twice as careful, he'd said. James had understood the warning intellectually, but he'd never expected to find himself at the center of a national controversy simply for having a conversation. The phone rang, and James picked it up. Captain Wilson speaking, sir. Captain, this is Admiral Hartman. I'll be brief. I've reviewed the videos of your interactions with former President Trump. While I believe you maintained appropriate military bearing, the situation has created a perception problem we need to address. I understand. Sir, good. Tomorrow at 0900, you'll meet with Navy leadership and public affairs. We need to develop a unified response to manage this situation. In the meantime, maintain radio silence on this matter. No statements, no social media, no emails about this to anyone. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Admiral. One more thing, Captain. The President has been briefed on this situation. James felt a chill run down his spine. The current president, a political rival to Trump, was now aware of their conversations. The White House press secretary will likely be asked about this at tomorrow's briefing. Admiral Hartman continued. We want to ensure the military remains above the political fray. After the call ended, James walked to the window of his cabin and looked out at the gray waters of the Norfolk harbor. His ship was scheduled for deployment in 3 weeks. He'd been focused on readiness drills and supply inventories. Now instead he was caught in a political storm not of his making. His phone buzzed with yet another notification. The hashtag Captain Wilson Speaks was trending nationwide. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about a conversation they hadn't heard in full. Between two men they didn't know personally. The simple act of two Americans talking had somehow become extraordinary in a divided nation. The Pentagon corridors felt different from the narrow passageways of a Navy destroyer. James walked beside a public affairs officer, a folder tucked under his arm containing printouts of every statement he'd made to Trump. They'd spent hours reviewing the conversations, preparing for the meeting. "Remember, keep your answers brief and factual," the officer advised as they approached a conference room. "This isn't a trial, but it's not a casual chat either." James nodded, his uniform feeling unusually tight around the collar despite fitting perfectly. When they entered the room, 8 people were seated around a long table: admirals, legal counsel, and communications directors. At the head sat the Secretary of the Navy, Captain Wilson, the secretary said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Thank you for coming." The meeting began with a review of military regulations regarding political activities. The Navy's legal counsel reminded everyone that active duty personnel were prohibited from using their official authority to influence an election or suggesting military endorsement of a political candidate. "To be clear," the woman said, looking directly at James, "we're not accusing you of intentionally violating these regulations, but perception matters as much as intent." James listened as they outlined the situation. Video clips of his conversations with Trump had been viewed over 20 million times. Political groups on both sides were using selective quotes to support their own narratives. 3 congressional committees had requested his testimony. "Sir, I never intended any of this," James said when given the chance to speak. "Former President Trump approached me. I maintained military bearing and avoided political statements." The secretary nodded. "We've reviewed the footage, Captain. You conducted yourself professionally. However, the situation has evolved beyond the actual content of your conversations." A communications director slid a tablet across the table showing social media posts. People were debating not just what James had said, but what his words represented about race relations, military culture, and national unity. "You've become a symbol, Captain Wilson," the secretary continued. "Some see your willingness to engage with the former president as a bridge across political divides. Others view it as a military officer being used for political purposes. What do you want me to do, sir?" James asked. "For now, nothing. Return to your ship. Prepare for your deployment as scheduled. We'll handle the media requests and congressional inquiries." The admiral sitting beside the secretary leaned forward. "Captain, while we believe you acted properly, this situation requires careful management. Until further notice, you are not authorized to make any public statements about your conversations with former President Trump." James understood the message. They wanted him to disappear from public view until the story died down. As the meeting concluded, the secretary asked James to remain behind. When they were alone, the older man's formal demeanor softened slightly. "This isn't fair to you, Captain. You didn't ask to be thrust into the national spotlight." "No, sir, I didn't. For what it's worth, I think you handled those conversations with remarkable poise. In another time, that might have been seen as simply 2 Americans talking across differences." James appreciated the comment but could hear the unspoken but hanging in the air. "The president will be asked about this at today's press conference," the secretary continued. "He's been briefed to say that the administration respects the professionalism of our military officers and has full confidence in their ability to remain nonpartisan. Thank you for telling me, sir." The secretary studied him for a moment. "You know, when I saw that first video, I was reminded of something. 20 years ago, people from different political backgrounds could have substantive conversations without it becoming a national incident. We've lost something important." James nodded but remained silent, aware that even in this private moment, anything he said could potentially be reported later. "Go back to your ship, Captain. Do your job. This will blow over eventually." 3 days later, James sat in his quarters aboard the USS Liberty, watching the president's press conference. As predicted, A reporter asked about the Trump-Wilson conversations. The president's response was carefully measured. The United States military is the most professional fighting force in the world. Our officers understand their duty to remain politically neutral, and I have complete confidence in their commitment to that principle. Next question. It was neither approval nor criticism, just a diplomatic non-answer designed to close the topic. James turned off the TV and opened his laptop. Despite the Navy's efforts to shield him, he'd received hundreds of emails from people across the country. Some praised him for showing respect to a former president. Others criticized him for the same reason. Some thanked him for demonstrating that civil conversation was still possible. Others accused him of naivety. He hadn't responded to any of them. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Commander Rodriguez. "Sir, there's something you should see," she said, handing him her tablet. It was a video of Trump at a rally in Ohio. The former president was speaking to a crowd of supporters when he mentioned James by name. "I met a fantastic Navy captain last week," Trump was saying. "Captain Wilson. Tremendous guy, tremendous leader. We had a great conversation about the military, about merit, about what makes America work." James felt a knot forming in his stomach as he watched. "And you know what? We didn't agree on everything. That's okay. That's how it should be. But we listened to each other. When's the last time you saw that in Washington?" The crowd cheered. Trump continued. "Some people, you know who they are. They want everyone at each other's throats. They don't want a black naval officer and someone like me finding common ground. Doesn't fit their narrative." James handed the tablet back to Rodriguez. "When was this?" 2 hours ago. It's already all over the news." James sat down at his desk, processing the implications. Trump had just made their conversation an explicit part of his political messaging. Whatever neutrality James had maintained was now further compromised. His phone rang. Navy Public Affairs. "Captain, we've been inundated with new media requests following Trump's comments. The Secretary wants to speak with you again." James closed his eyes briefly. "Tell him I'll be available whenever he needs me." After ending the call, he looked at Rodriguez. "XO, how's the crew handling all this?" "Mixed reactions, sir. Some are proud their captain is being mentioned by a former president. Others are uncomfortable with the political attention. Most just want to focus on our deployment. And what do you think?" Rodriguez hesitated. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Always. I think you're caught in a no-win situation. No matter what you do or don't do now, half the country will love you and half will hate you." James nodded slowly. "That about sums it up." That evening, as James was reviewing maintenance logs in his quarters, his sister called. "Hey, big brother," she said when he answered. "Just checking in. You doing okay with all this craziness?" "I'm managing," he replied. "How's Mom taking it?" "She's worried naturally, but also kind of proud. Dad would have been too, you know." James smiled at the mention of their father, who had passed away 2 years earlier. "I'm not so sure. He always warned me to stay away from politics." "True, but he also taught us to stand up for what we believe in, to be honest about who we are." "That's what's frustrating about this whole situation," James said. "I didn't say anything I don't believe. I was just having a conversation with another person. A person who happens to be one of the most polarizing figures in the country," his sister pointed out. "Yeah, there is that." After a pause, she asked, "So what happens now? Are you in trouble with the Navy?" "Not officially. They understand I didn't seek this out. But they've ordered me not to make any public statements about the conversations. And Trump just brought it up again at a rally. You saw that?" "Everyone saw it, James. It's everywhere." She hesitated. "Have you thought about what you'd say if you could speak publicly?" James considered the question. "I'd probably say that two people with different perspectives should be able to talk respectfully, without it becoming national news. That finding some common ground doesn't mean you agree on everything. That listening to someone doesn't equal endorsing them. That sounds like something Dad would say." "Yeah, it does." James smiled sadly. "But for now, I'm under orders to stay quiet." "And you always follow orders," his sister said. "That's why you're Captain James Wilson." After they hung up, James walked to the small window in his quarters and looked out at the night sky. Stars shimmered above the dark water. In 2 weeks, his ship would deploy to the Mediterranean, and perhaps this strange episode would fade from public memory. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Captain Wilson, this is Donald Trump Jr. My father would like to speak with you. Please call when you have a moment. A phone number followed. James stared at the message in disbelief. The former president wanted to speak with him again? After everything that had happened? He set the phone down without responding, unsure what to do. Another knock at his door. This time it was his communications officer. Sir, the White House is on the line. The president would like a word. James felt as if he were in some bizarre dream. The current president and the former president both wanted to speak with him, a Navy captain who, until a week ago, had been focused solely on commanding his ship. Tell them I'll take the call, he said. As he waited for the connection, James thought about how strange life could be. One random encounter, one honest conversation, and suddenly he was at the center of forces far larger than himself. Whatever happened next, he would stay true to his principles, duty, honor, and integrity. The rest was beyond his control. 4 months had passed since the conversations that changed James's life. The Mediterranean deployment had provided a welcome escape from the media frenzy. At sea, with limited connectivity and a busy operational schedule, James had been able to focus on what he did best, leading his ship and crew. Now, as the USS Liberty approached Norfolk Naval Station after a successful deployment, James stood on the bridge watching the familiar coastline emerge through the morning mist. He felt a mix of emotions, pride in his crew's performance, relief at returning home, and apprehension about what awaited him on shore. Nervous about going back, sir? Commander Rodriguez asked, joining him at the window. A little, James admitted. Have things died down? Somewhat. You're not headline news anymore. But those conversations with Trump are still referenced in articles about civil discourse and race relations. James nodded. During their deployment, he'd maintained his silence as ordered, declining all interview requests forwarded through Navy channels. Both the current and former presidents had respected his position after brief, private conversations where James had politely explained his desire to focus on his military duties. But he couldn't hide at sea forever. The Admiral wants to see you as soon as we dock, Rodriguez added. He said it's important. The Admiral's office overlooked the naval base. As James entered, he noticed a stack of folders on the desk, each bearing his name. Welcome home, Captain Wilson, Admiral Richardson said, shaking his hand. Outstanding job in the Mediterranean. Your ship performed exceptionally. Thank you, sir. The crew deserves the credit. Always modest. The Admiral gestured for James to sit. We need to discuss your next assignment. James had expected this. His current command was scheduled to end in 3 months. I've received some unusual requests regarding your future, the Admiral continued, tapping the folders. 3 congressional committees still want you to testify about diversity in the military. The Naval Academy wants you as an instructor in leadership ethics, and the Secretary of the Navy has suggested you for a position as a military liaison to a new bipartisan commission on improving civil discourse. James remained silent. Processing these options, what do you want, Captain? The Admiral asked. Sir, I joined the Navy to serve at sea. My preference would be another ship command. The Admiral leaned back in his chair. I thought you might say that. The thing is, James, you've become more than just a ship captain. Whether you intended it or not, you've come to represent something important to many Americans. With respect, sir, I'm just an officer doing my job. We both know it's more complicated than that now. The Admiral pushed a newspaper across the desk. It was dated 2 weeks ago with the headline, The Wilson Effect, How a Naval Officer's Conversations with Trump Inspired New Dialogue Programs. James skimmed the article, which detailed how several universities and community organizations had created discussion forums explicitly modeled after his exchanges with Trump, bringing together people with different political views for structured, respectful conversations. I had nothing to do with any of this, James said. That's exactly the point. You didn't set out to start a movement. You were just being yourself, thoughtful, honest, willing to listen and speak your mind regardless of who was across from you. The Admiral paused. That's becoming rare in America today. James set the newspaper down. What are you suggesting, sir? I'm suggesting that sometimes our greatest service isn't what we planned. The Navy has shaped you into a leader, and now there's an opportunity to use that leadership in a way that might benefit the country beyond traditional military service. 2 weeks later, James stood at a podium in the Naval Academy auditorium, facing a room full of midshipmen, future Navy and Marine Corps officers. This was his first public speaking engagement since returning from deployment, approved by Navy leadership as an appropriate venue to break his silence. "When I was sitting where you are now," he began, "I had a clear vision of my future naval career. Ship assignments, deployments, eventually command. What I never imagined was that a simple conversation would thrust me into a national spotlight." The auditorium was silent, every young face attentive. "You've all heard about my exchanges with former President Trump. They've been analyzed, criticized, and praised more than they probably deserve. Today I want to share what I learned from that experience, not about politics but about leadership." James took a breath, remembering the months of reflection during his deployment. "As military officers, we serve alongside people from every background, belief system, and political persuasion. Our effectiveness depends on our ability to work together despite those differences. The same is true for our nation." He stepped away from the podium, preferring a more direct connection with the audience. What made those conversations noteworthy wasn't their content, it was simply that they happened at all. Two people with different perspectives, listening to each other with respect. That shouldn't be remarkable in America, but somehow it has become so. James walked slowly across the stage. "The most important leadership lesson I can share with you today is this. True leadership means being willing to engage with people who see the world differently than you do. It means listening first to understand, not just to respond. It means finding common ground without compromising your principles." A hand raised in the audience. James nodded to the midshipman. "Sir, were you worried about backlash when you spoke with former President Trump?" "I wasn't at first because I didn't expect anyone to notice," James replied honestly. "But once it became public, yes, I was concerned about how it would be perceived. The lesson there is that leadership often means making yourself vulnerable. You can't connect with people authentically if you're constantly calculating the political implications of every word." Another hand went up. "Captain Wilson, do you think the military has a role to play in healing the nation's divisions?" James considered the question carefully. "Not directly. Our job is to defend the nation, not reform it. But indirectly, the military does offer a model of how people with different backgrounds and beliefs can unite around a common mission. We focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. There's something valuable in that approach." After the lecture, James met with a small group of black midshipmen who had requested a private conversation. They gathered in a small conference room, the formality of ranks temporarily set aside. "Sir, we wanted to thank you," said a young woman with lieutenant's bars on her uniform. "Seeing you navigate that situation with such dignity meant a lot to us." "I was just trying to stay true to my oath," James replied. A midshipman spoke up. "Some of my friends back home called you a sellout for talking with Trump. Others said you were a hero for the same reason. How did you deal with people projecting their politics onto you?" "By remembering who I actually am," James said. "People will always try to make you a symbol for their cause. Your job is to stay grounded in your own values." The conversation continued for an hour, touching on the challenges of maintaining personal integrity in politically charged environments. James found himself energized by their questions and perspectives. As the meeting concluded, the senior lieutenant said, "Sir, you mentioned during your talk that you're considering a new role outside traditional ship command. Can you tell us more about that?" James nodded. "I've been offered a position leading a new training initiative. It would involve creating dialogue programs for military personnel and civilian government employees, teaching the skills of productive conversation across differences. Are you going to take it?" "I'm still deciding. Part of me still wants that next ship command." James smiled. "But I'm beginning to see that there are different ways to serve." 3 months later, James stood in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. Around the table sat an unlikely gathering: Democratic and Republican lawmakers, military officials, education leaders, and community organizers. At the head of the table was the president, Captain Wilson. "The floor is yours," the president said. James, now in a new role as director of the National Dialogue Initiative, outlined the program they had developed. A curriculum for teaching the skills of constructive conversation across political and cultural divides. Initially for government agencies, but eventually for schools and community organizations. "This isn't about getting everyone to agree," James explained. "It's about helping Americans remember how to talk to each other, especially when they disagree." From the back of the room, a familiar voice spoke up. "I think it's a tremendous idea. Really tremendous. James turned to see Donald Trump invited as a former president to this bipartisan initiative. Their eyes met and Trump gave a slight nod of recognition. After the meeting, as people mingled in small groups, Trump approached James. "Captain," he said, extending his hand. "Or should I call you Commander now?" "Still Captain, sir," James replied as they shook hands. "Just with a different kind of ship," Trump chuckled. "Who would have thought that our little chat would lead to all this?" "Not me, that's for certain." "You know, they'll say this is all politics," Trump said, gesturing around the room where Democrats and Republicans were cautiously interacting. "Maybe some of it is. But sometimes good things happen even when politics is involved." James nodded. "Sometimes they do." As Trump moved away to speak with others, James felt a sense of completion. The unexpected conversation that had thrust him into the spotlight had evolved into something meaningful. Not because of political maneuvering or media attention, but because it had reminded people of something essential about American democracy, the ability to talk across differences. Later that evening, as James drove home, his phone rang. It was Anthony, the teenager from Michigan who had emailed him months ago. They had stayed in touch, with James serving as an informal mentor. "I saw you on TV today, sir," Anthony said excitedly. "At the White House. What did you think?" James asked. "I think it's cool that something good came from all that drama. My parents still disagree about politics, but they're actually talking more and yelling less." "That's progress," James said, smiling. "And I got my acceptance to the Naval Academy prep school yesterday." "Congratulations!" "That's outstanding news." As they talked about Anthony's future plans, James reflected on the strange journey of the past year. A chance encounter, an honest conversation, national controversy, and now a new purpose. Not the career path he had envisioned, but perhaps the one the country needed. Sometimes leadership meant following an unexpected course. And sometimes the most important conversations were the ones that seemed simplest. Two people talking and truly hearing each other, despite their differences. In a divided nation, that had become a radical act, and maybe, just maybe, it was also the beginning of a way forward.